Nobody warned these European soccer fans that the biggest shock of the World Cup summer would not come from the stadium at all. It would come from a border agent stamp, a viral headline about ICE raids, and a bribery scandal still shadowing the very organization running the tournament. Before a single ball got kicked, thousands of visitors landed in the United States already braced for chaos, division, and hostility, because that is the story European newsrooms had been telling for years. What they found instead was a country far stranger, far kinder, and far more politically tense than the postcard version anyone expected. Let's start with the part nobody argues about. The size of this place breaks your brain. The first jolt for a European fan does not come from the football atmosphere at all. It comes from empty space, an endless stretch of nothing that swallows up every idea of distance a person has ever known. Picture driving across 7 European countries back to back: France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Luxembourg, Austria, and Switzerland, one after another. Add up every hour that drive would take, and you still would not have crossed the state of Texas. That is one state. Europeans grow up measuring a country in a couple of hours on a train, where a 2-hour drive gets you a new language, a new soup, and a new currency to fumble with. In America, you climb into a car, put your foot down, and drive for something like 12 to 14 straight hours through Texas alone. And when your back finally gives out and you check the map, you are still in Texas. That single stretch is long enough to cover the entire length of the United Kingdom, or to cut through 7 Central European nations without ever slipping across a real border. A domestic flight from San Diego to New York eats up around 7 hours in the air, which happens to be almost exactly the time it takes to fly from New York across the Atlantic back to London. On paper, you are just hopping to another city for a match. Emotionally, you have crossed half the planet. America's national parks alone cover something like 133,000 square miles, a patch of protected wilderness bigger than the entire United Kingdom. Long-distance couples feel it too. A European who calls 3 months apart from a partner a hardship gets quietly confused talking to an American who considers an 8-hour drive a normal monthly visit. Because 3 hours in Europe might land you in a different country, while 3 hours from San Diego just gets you further into California. Then there are the roads themselves, stacked highways with dozens of lanes tangled overhead like concrete on top of concrete. Nothing like the narrow lanes of old Paris or London. A Costco parking lot alone looks big enough to host a small stadium packed wall to wall with oversized trucks. This is one country stretched across 4 different time zones, so a friend on the West Coast can get invited to watch a match at 8 in the evening and text back before the sun on their side has even gone down. It is not just geography, it is psychological pressure, a blunt reminder of how small Europe's tidy public transportation system looks against a continent this size. Because here, you cannot just walk to the stadium, and you cannot count on a bus showing up on time either. None of that, though, prepares a visitor for Walmart. European fans came for the World Cup and somehow had their most disorienting cultural moment inside a supercenter. Some of these stores are large enough to more or less run their own zip code. Car tires sit displayed a few feet from bananas and fresh produce, an arrangement no European convenience store would ever attempt. Chip bags come nearly the size of a small child. Cream and detergent get sold in jugs closer to a gallon, the kind of container that back home would only ever hold floor cleaner. Show up in October, looking for World Cup snacks, and you might find a holiday aisle already stretching on for dozens of storefronts worth of space. Because American retailers do not wait for the future, they sell it 2 months ahead of schedule. Shoppers zip around on electric carts. A McDonald's or a Subway sits tucked inside the building for resupply runs, and melatonin, a supplement practically impossible to buy over the counter in the United Kingdom, sits stacked on an open shelf for a few dollars. A basic iron might run about $13. It leaves you wondering whether this is the purest expression of consumer freedom or a beautifully lit trap designed to make you leave with 4 new tires when you only came in for milk. From there, the shocks move to the football field, or rather, to the fields where teenagers play. In England or Germany, school sports usually means a handful of kids kicking a half-flat ball next to a parking lot, with maybe 2 stray dogs and 1 bored security guard watching. In America, high school and college sports look like the Olympics had a baby with the Super Bowl. Marching bands with hundreds of musicians, fireworks, mascots who are paid a real salary. Stadiums in Texas or Alabama built for crowds in the tens of thousands. Tickets gone months in advance for a game played by kids who are 17 or 18 years old. Ask an American fan how long they will support their college team, and the answer comes back instantly: forever. It raises an uncomfortable question, too, whether turning school sports into a multi-million-dollar spectacle nurtures real talent or quietly steals a piece of these kids' childhoods. The way people actually watch the games surprised Europeans just as much as the size of the stadiums. In Europe, 90 minutes on the pitch feels like a life-or-death event. Fans locked in, eyes glued to the ball, nerves shot by halftime. In America, especially at college football or baseball games, people show up to eat, chat, and only glance at the field when the crowd erupts. Huge trays of food, beer, conversations with backs turned to the action. Sports treated as an excuse to gather rather than a holy war. While police in parts of Italy or Spain gear up in riot armor for football matches, American police at these events tend to smile, take pictures with fans, and let the crowd do its thing, at least at the youth and college level. That contrast between relaxed crowds and a much harder political mood outside the stadium became one of the real stories of this World Cup. Because while European visitors kept running into strangers who paid for their dinner, plenty of others arrived nervous and for real reasons. Ahead of the tournament, a coalition of more than 120 immigrant rights and civil society organizations issued a joint travel advisory to the roughly 10 million visitors expected across the 11 United States host cities, warning that federal immigration enforcement under the current administration created serious risk for certain travelers, particularly people from immigrant communities, racial and ethnic minorities, and LGBTQ travelers. Some fan groups from England reportedly decided to keep a lower profile at matches inside the country over similar concerns, treating the warnings less as certain danger and more as a version of events worth taking seriously rather than dismissing outright. Homeland Security officials pushed back hard on the idea that agents would use the tournament as cover for mass arrests. The secretary overseeing the department told television interviewers plainly that immigration agents were not going to go up masse at World Cup venues, framing their presence around stadium security rather than enforcement sweeps. Still, trust stayed fragile heading into kickoff, especially after a Somali soccer referee was reportedly denied entry into the country in the days before the tournament began, an incident that spread quickly among fans and only deepened existing unease, even as officials insisted no broad crackdown at the games themselves was planned. Independent human rights researchers who reviewed government enforcement data covering roughly the year before the tournament found that immigration arrests inside the metro areas of the host cities numbered in the hundreds of thousands, a figure that, true or exaggerated in specifics, became part of the backdrop every visiting fan had heard about before they ever landed. At the same time, the administration made a notable exception for World Cup travelers. Citizens from 5 nations whose teams qualified, including Algeria, Cape Verde, Ivory Coast, Senegal, and Tunisia, had originally been required to post a refundable bond running as high as $15,000 just to enter the country, a policy meant to discourage visa overstays. Weeks before the opening match, the State Department quietly waived that bond requirement for fans from those countries who could show valid match tickets and had registered through FIFA's expedited visa system, alongside earlier exemptions already granted to players, coaches, and team staff. Officials called it proof the country wanted to welcome the largest and finest World Cup ever, even as critics pointed out the waiver only applied to a relatively narrow group, reportedly a few hundred travelers in total, while the broader immigration climate for ordinary visitors and residents remained largely unchanged. That tension, warm welcome on one hand, hard-edged enforcement anxiety on the other, ran underneath nearly every story fans told about their trip. It is the same split that showed up in the small kindnesses Europeans kept describing once they actually got out on American streets. Take the now well-circulated story out of Quincy Market in Boston, where a group of Scottish fans in kilts sat down for dinner, and when they went to pay, a waiter told them the bill had already been covered by a stranger at the next table who left only a short message wishing them a good time in the country. No cameras, no gimmick, just an unprompted act of generosity that left the group stunned. Americans strike up conversations everywhere. On buses, in convenience store lines, on sidewalks, complimenting shoes or asking which team a stranger is rooting for, the kind of open friendliness that would read as suspicious back home. Ask for directions, and someone might just walk several blocks with you to make sure you land in the right place. It is the sort of hospitality that makes a skeptical European ask what the catch is, and more often than not, there simply is not one. Restaurants delivered their own culture shock, mostly around the concept of free refills. A soda in London or Paris might run close to $5, and asking for a second glass means paying again. In America, that same drink costs around $3 to $5 upfront, and then it just keeps coming, refilled by servers who show up like clockwork every few minutes without ever adding a line to the check. Fans worked out they could save somewhere between $12 and $16 a meal, simply by not paying for extra water or soda, a detail that briefly turned mild delight into low-grade outrage about what they had been missing their whole lives back home. Then there is Texas barbecue, treated by locals less like a meal and more like a religion, with pitmasters standing in for priests, beef ribs served in slabs weighing close to 1.5 pounds, smoked low and slow for around 16 hours until the meat falls apart without needing a drop of sauce. One German visitor, someone who grew up considering himself a connoisseur of sausage, reportedly called it the best sausage he had ever eaten in his life. Trays piled with ribs, brisket, pork belly, and mashed potatoes run close to $100, and more than one fan admitted they seriously considered canceling their flight home just to keep eating. American convenience culture kept surprising people too, especially the sprawling drive-through economy. Beyond the usual fast food window, visitors found drive-through pharmacies, drive-through barbecue pickup, and drive-through banks where a driver pulls up to a machine, deposits or withdraws cash, and never leaves the air conditioning of the car. Compare that to a typical bank visit in England or France, complete with parking a half-mile away and a 20 to 25-minute wait in line. And it is easy to see why one British tourist joked that Americans had apparently become too lazy to even walk inside to commit financial fraud properly. American flags turned out to be everywhere, on porches, factory roofs, highway trucks, even printed on tissue boxes in the supermarket. A level of open patriotism that would read as unusually intense in much of Western Europe. During national moments like Flag Day, entire communities paused together, hands over hearts, in a display that struck more than one visitor as genuinely moving rather than performative. Texas flies its state flag at the same enormous size as the national flag, a quiet but unmistakable statement of independent identity within the country. Portion sizes rounded out the list of shocks. A small coffee in an American cafe often looks closer to a European large. A serving of ribs weighing close to 1.25 pounds would get split among 4 people back home. Breakfast plates mixing sweet pancakes soaked in syrup with salty sausage and bacon on the same dish struck British visitors as borderline heretical, yet thoroughly enjoyable anyway. Snack aisles stocked with dozens of chip flavors, family-sized bundles clearly built to feed a crowd. All of it left visitors torn between guilt over the excess and genuine appreciation for the abundance. Underneath all of that hospitality and excess, though, sat a football story with its own political weight. Because the World Cup itself arrived trailing years of scandal at FIFA's highest levels. Just days before the opening match, football legend Michel Platini filed a criminal complaint in Paris against FIFA president Gianni Infantino, along with two former FIFA officials, alleging they had orchestrated a coordinated effort to block Platini from ever running for the FIFA presidency back when Sepp Blatter's tenure was ending. Platini and Blatter had already been cleared of the underlying financial allegations against them by Swiss courts, first in 2022 and again on final appeal in 2025. But the fight over how Platini got shut out of that presidential race apparently was not over. FIFA has not issued a detailed public response to the complaint, so at this point it remains an accusation working its way through French courts rather than a settled fact. Though it added an awkward political cloud right as Infantino stood on stage promoting what he called the largest World Cup ever. The broader bribery scandal that first rocked FIFA back in 2015 also resurfaced this year in an unexpected way. A federal judge dismissed long-running criminal charges against a media executive tied to the full-play bribery case after the Justice Department indicated the prosecution no longer matched the current administration's priorities, a decision that landed right around the anniversary of the original wave of indictments against more than a dozen soccer officials. Separately, two longtime fugitives connected to the same sprawling investigation, the Jinkus father and son pair, reportedly resurfaced this year seeking a plea deal with federal prosecutors more than a decade after the scheme first came to light. None of this touches the tournament on the field directly, but it is a reminder that the organization running the World Cup has spent a full decade trying to shake off its reputation for institutional corruption, even as reporting continues to describe the relationship between FIFA and the current United States government as unusually close and, in the words of one European outlet, more than a little murky. On the football side itself, the underdog stories carried real weight too. Canada's run through this tournament became one of the feel-good storylines of the summer before it finally ended in a loss to Morocco, a result that still marked a historic high point for a program that spent decades on the outside, looking in at major international tournaments. That result sat alongside a wider sense that this World Cup, spread across 11 American cities plus stops in Mexico and Canada, was reshaping who gets taken seriously on the global stage, both in football and in the geopolitics surrounding it. By the 4th of July, with the country marking its 250th birthday right in the middle of the tournament, the two storylines, joyful cultural exchange and uneasy political backdrop, had fully merged into one narrative. Analysts covering the overlap noted that the World Cup was teaching the country something about itself, even as it reminded visiting fans that America is more complicated and often more welcoming than its loudest headlines suggest. European fans kept describing a country that felt safer, cleaner, and warmer than advertised, from tidy streets in Boston to friendly conversations in Kansas, even while acknowledging the same country was dealing with a genuinely tense immigration climate that human rights groups had spent months publicly warning visitors about. So which version is true? Maybe both. A stranger really did pay for a group of kilted Scots to eat dinner in Boston. A Somali referee really was reportedly turned away at the border days before kickoff. Federal officials really did promise no mass raids at stadiums, while outside groups really did tell 10 million visitors to travel carefully anyway. FIFA really is being sued by one of the sport's most respected former stars over how power got handed down a decade ago. An allegation still unproven in court, none of that cancels out the other. It just means that this World Cup, more than any before it, forced fans to hold two very different Americas in their heads at the same time. The one that hands you a free refill with a smile, and the one that makes you double-check your paperwork before you fly. There is also a quieter economic angle to all this that rarely makes the highlight reels, but shapes everything fans experience on the ground. Host cities poured enormous public and private money into stadium upgrades, transit shuttles, and temporary fan zones, banking on the idea that a month-long global tournament would pay for itself many times over in tourism revenue and long-term reputation. Local officials in several host cities have publicly framed the tournament as a once-in-a-generation showcase, hoping visiting fans go home describing exactly the kind of friendly, over-the-top, slightly chaotic country these 10 stories capture, rather than the version splashed across nightly news segments back in Europe. Whether that bet pays off in hard economic numbers will take months to sort out, but the anecdotal evidence from fans wandering out of barbecue joints and drive-through banks certainly suggests the charm offensive worked on plenty of individual visitors, even if the politics surrounding the tournament stayed far messier than the marketing ever admitted.